book of Acts. We'll be somewhere in the chapters of 16 to 20 range, if you're looking from a textual standpoint. We are bridging between what we typically refer to as Paul's second and third evangelistic and encouragement journey. And so we'll be looking at that. As noted above, we've solved our technical issues from last week, and so we've got our visual aids, which are often pretty important for a historical timeline study, but we've got it put back together again. At this time, though, if you would bow with me in prayer, and then after that prayer, we'll begin our study and conversation. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the blessings that we share in Christ. We thank you for the encouragement that is brought to us by our brethren. Help us to be mindful of our relationships, to be thankful for the strength that we provide to one another in our faith and in our lives. Help us to grow and to be useful in the kingdom. We offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. So again, we are looking at the story of the work of the Gospels move from two different center points. Last week we emphasized something unique that takes place, if you haven't kind of noticed it, because we talked about the council in Jerusalem and these relationships between Christians in the first century. And it's only probably for me in the last 4 or 5 years that I kind of noticed this from a overview standpoint, like looking down at the map and seeing how things played out. That at the time that this takes place, for the most part, in our north section up in this one of the two Antiochs of antiquity, most of the Gentile Christians are connected and centered to Antioch. Most of the evangelistic work that Paul and Barnabas do early on is using Antioch as essentially a hub where he returns back to it, or they return back to it. This is also kind of an interconnected aspect because when you go to Jerusalem, most of the work involving Jewish converts to Christianity centered and started in Jerusalem and continued up until AD 66, 67 or so, approximately. And that's the time when those disciples began to spread. In advance of the impending destruction, there are two historical factors that drive that. One is the obvious warnings that they were given by prophecy, that they understood and recognized. But also, as the conflict of Rome and the Judean region got higher and higher, everyone's like, we shouldn't live here anymore. And so, if you go back through history, you find that not only Jews, but many individuals in advance of the impending crushing foot of Rome just said, we're out. We are going to go somewhere else. And many of the folks who were living in this region at that time were not exclusively from this area, and so they would be going back to their home areas. For the Christians in particular, their migratory patterns match the Jewish communities. And so for the Christians, even the Gentile Christians in Jerusalem that were a very tiny minority, they matched and went out predominantly to the areas where there were strongholds of Jewish communities. Kind of rational, because it's those Jewish communities that Paul had visited early on to spread the gospel. And so these two different communities that we often think about, they should be one, right? They're the same faith. They're the same theological space at this point. They were not only separated by ethnicity and their historical spiritual backgrounds, but this regional separation is pretty substantial too, because there's a huge difference in Roman colonized Judea and Jerusalem and Roman-owned Antioch. There's law differences, there's power disparities, there's the way people are treated in those communities too. When you are Jewish or even Christian, which is seen as a segment of Judaism at this time in Jerusalem, you have rights. You have power up until around 67, 68 or so. In Antioch, it's the opposite. You are a minority. You're one of the masses. You have no power, no agency in that context. And so you have a different outcome of what is going on there. So that spread, if you will, takes place. And we talked about a lot of this last week without as much of the visual side of things. Today we're going to pick up and pay attention to, if you're in your printed texts, lesson 48, but textually wise, we're picking up around the book of Acts and chapter 18 now. So we've inched forward to think about what's going on here. And you'll see, especially as we get maybe a little bit closer into this view, there's a series of steps that Paul makes in this work. Remember, this is now latter context. Good amount of time has taken place from their first journey. Many of these churches would have had the chance to strengthen themselves internally, but there's a new set of goals. The new goals for these churches is that they would then be able to appoint leadership, elders, deacons, become part of the congregational relationship. This is also helps us understand the letters that Paul would write to Timothy and Titus. It would help us to understand some of the encouragement and specific instruction given in Peter's writings, in the writings of the letters to these regions, Galatians and Ephesians, that relate to all of this. And you can think about it in another way. So as you're in your life over the last 15 years, have you recognized that 10 years ago you made this choice and you're like, if I had had a little bit more wisdom, I would have done something different? If I had a little more thoughtfulness or mindfulness? What do we say about ourselves when that happens? What are some phrases that we use to describe ourselves? I use that one a lot. That's a fair one. Rich?
If I knew now let's see. If I knew then what I know now, right?
Right, and that's, or like, those are all in the category of, I'm growing up. I'm learning some stuff, learning about myself. If you think about these churches as the organic gathering of humans that they are, these churches are growing up. Not all of them mature at the same rate. Some of them have different points to begin with. Their problems actually mimic our individual problems when we are growing up spiritually and physically. How do I interact with people? What's my method? Like, okay, am I going to be kind and sharing, or am I going to be selfish? Some of the issues that you see in Corinth, some of the issues you see in these relationships between Christians that James writes about, that Paul writes about to the churches in Thessalonica, those are basic human things that if we don't intentionally develop those skills, then we end up being malformed, inappropriately grown. So when you think back to what Paul says to these churches, sometimes he's stern. He's very structured. And he says, like to the church of Corinth, look, here it is. I'm going to have to do some stuff. I don't like it. You're not going to like it, but it's for your own good. Other letters that go back in this time frame are very encouraging. It's as if he's saying, look, you already know the right thing to do. Just do that. Things like, you heard me preach this. You saw my example. Follow after it. So all of this categorically is a phase that you can think about it, not just Paul's evangelistic journey. Luke is using that story as the structure to tell us these churches are growing up. They're maturing. And part of that maturation process then also includes a series of admonitions through both Paul, Apollos, Barnabas, Timothy, and Titus to ensure that shepherds, elders are appointed. And that kind of coalesces all those thoughts together. That's independent for us than us thinking about what the qualities would be, the criteria, some of the specific details. But that's what's going on. And it's taking place over a good spread of time. And so if you start thinking about what goes on here, this is about a 4-year endeavor. This exceeds the typical time of service away from the United States for nearly everybody who served in World War II. They had long, unending contracts. You signed, it was till the end. But for the most part, most of the U.S. soldiers in that generation, their time away overseas was either broken up by return trips for various reasons or the cap of the length of the conflict. 4 years is a long time, and no matter what you think about it. And so in 4 years of travel, Paul's interactions are going to be spread across a number of areas. They will be inclusive of him going in person and checking on things, also writing letters, also encouraging through subsidiary second-hand conversations in that process. His journey departs from Antioch in Syria. It's that northern Antioch we already talked about. He's going to travel through Galatia and Phrygia. And it says, chapter 18, verses 22 and 23, to strengthen the churches. So, establish elders. One of the key responsibilities he cites off to Timothy. I want you to do this. Please do this, Titus as well. But the broader principle is what strengthens a church. And so the work underneath all of this, that's why it's going on, is to make these churches, in essence, more stable. Here we've got the Roman road that is north of Tarsus. Galatia and Phrygia is a region space here. And so this is what he's looking at. This shows us what a Roman road looks like, pretty recent. I think this photo is from about 8 or 9 years ago. And it's a pretty clear look at what his journey looks like. Because that whole region has a whole lot of stuff that looks just like this. These are what those spots look like. That's the roadbed still from where he would have traveled. So there's Paul again. And I wanted to, especially as we got into the New Testament text side of this particular study for this year, re-emphasize something that we've also been doing in the Wednesday night class. When we look at these events, these stories from the scriptures, and story is a perfectly appropriate term to refer to these histories. But you got to remember that this is not a fanciful tale. These are real people doing real things, walking at real places that you can go and put your foot on and say, right here is where they were. And it's important to make that shift because at times, if we get lost in our spiritualized conclusions, our theology, we could forget that this is rooted in reality. Well, these are actual events, real histories of God doing real work to bring the gospel to all of us. So the story will go forward as the text moves, and he's going to go to Ephesus. In this region, the area space, it's effectively one of the greatest cities of the Mediterranean region, as equal of importance to where he left in Antioch of Syria, and equivalent to Alexandria of Egypt. And so these are like the big hubs of all humanity, all those Roman road structures that are designed to move two things. You know, the Roman roads only had two real jobs, to move the army and to move the taxes. So the money flowed back into Rome to pay for everything, and the armies could get out to everywhere else. All the other things were secondary benefits to this road structure. And they all circled around and created a system so that Paul and others could then move on top of it. It's capital province of the area. It's a major trade center. And it includes regional religions. There's some terms that we use to describe every religious practice outside of Christianity when we're together. We refer to them as pagan. Typically, that's a common phrase, pagan religions. It's important to kind of, at times, separate them into categories to know what you're dealing with. Not every pagan religion is the same. They don't all have the same problems, and they certainly don't have the same influence. As a consequence of this area, the region here we're looking at, and we'll see its map in a second, the historical space underneath it, the Greco-Roman context, has a lot of religious practices that are city-based or city-state-based. That means the city and then the area right around it. And they are all kind of viewed competitively with one another. And when a certain city gets more populous, more powerful, history perceives that it's a more influential god, and the god was more successful at doing God stuff. And so this time frame, inside Ephesus, there is depending on your language you're pulling from, Artemis, Diana, The Temple of Diana is present there. It's a big, in essence, cult at this point. And it was financially significant that it brought wealth to the city. The greatest parallel for us to think about the value of having this in a city is to think about what we're willing to spend in community dollars to attract a national sports team. We spend a lot of money, US-based, right, to make a team happen in a certain community. Like we give them tax discounts, we're willing to help pay for stadiums, and that's a lot of money. Under the idea that that money then will then improve the community, right? The concept is if we allow these tax breaks, give this discounted bonds, even pay for a stadium, we will net a return. And generally speaking, that's what happens. Like on a rough basis, yeah, you do bring that much extra economic activity, and there are costs to it. But that's what's going on here. So imagine, if you will, someone coming into town and definitively saying that Atlanta has to Atlanta as a whole, abandon the Falcons. Now, sometimes based on their record, that's not a big challenge. If we want to make it really painful, pick your college sports team in your small town. Like you can't root for the Dogs anymore. You just can't. It's divinely connected. Like this is not just you're now going to root for another team level. This is God has declared you cannot engage in this practice anymore. And people are saying, yeah, it sounds good to me. That's the level of tension that gets close to what you're going on here with Paul's preaching and how the city cult members responded to it. Demetrius and the other silversmiths mostly were concerned about their trade. They're the restaurant owners, they're the hotel owners in our illustration. And there's a lot you can think about there, but you start thinking about this picture that's going on. This is a large kind of imaging, if you will, of the work of God's kingdom. We always make a side note that Paul's solution to this problem isn't to repurpose the workers into a new field. He doesn't say to those guys, hey, you know what? We could solve this if you just started making silver crosses. If you make some relics, just get in the relic trade. Here you go. Just make some copies of the temple and sell those. And you're net, no problem, right? It's a good point to kind of catch that Paul's solutions to these problems, the gospel solutions, are never really about accommodation. They're about what is the spiritual imperative? What is the truth underneath there? This also is a connection to where we meet a pretty notable couple. We've got Aquila and Priscilla connected here. Apollos branches off to Achaia. Paul will later write regarding the work that's going on in the region. I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. This is one of the Bible passages that I think is important for us to connect to at all times historically when it comes to a congregation's health and welfare. If you're someone like me who tries to be incredibly organized, I'm not great at it all the time, but I really do try to be incredibly organized. I try to think about, hey, how can I make this happen? How can I plan to have this outcome? There is zero way to really accurately plan the growth of a congregation positively or negatively. You can do your work. You can do your work, you can plant, you can water, but in the end, this is the way that I think about it. God gives the increase. Whatever that increase is what is needed and necessary at the time. And I always add this little caveat in my head thinking about the text. The increase isn't about the numbers. We think it's numbers. My mind does. My heart does sometimes too. But logically, that's not what increase is in the greater context of the Bible. Increase is what Paul also referred to in his work, that the church is strengthened. So if the work is causing Christians to be stronger spiritually, that's increase. If the work is causing souls to come to the gospel, that is also increase. If the work is causing people to make a decision as to whom they're going to serve, that is also increase. All of those things are equally increase. But in our minds, and my heart too, and probably yours at times, increase is nickels and noses. That's a Warren King phrase. It's trademarked, but I'll use it again. And our nickels and noses board is back there. Our brain thinks nickels and noses. But the Bible never shows that as being the actual criteria of growth. It's just our emotions. But this is what we're seeing. We're seeing that growth take place. And you're seeing this long journey branch it all out. You'll notice in the text, at times you see some of the connections. Here's a bronze coin, Claudius from Alexandria. This would have been the currency of the time frame. So when Paul is making these journeys and bringing funds from one church to another, this is the kind of stuff he's carrying. These kind of coins of the region. How many of you gone to an international airport and you step off the airport and they've got 14 different little kiosks there to change your money? Every city had that at the gates. There's a couple things that are in the historic gates of most major cities. The first thing you see when you enter are temples. They have little small temples to get blessings for leaving and going. And so there's all the regional gods would be there. So you'd have your city elders at the gate. You'd walk in. There'd be the regional gods, so you can make your sacrifices if you're going or leaving, and then money changers. So you could take your money from one country, one region, give it there, and get the coin of the realm from the new country, and they would charge you a fee. That particular practice has not changed. And the feeling you have when you see your money get less value hasn't changed probably either, because that's actually something that's dealt with in the text at times. And so this is the kind of thing that Paul would have been doing. Here is a view of Ephesus. This is looking from the south, and this is the market space area that Paul would have interacted with. This is Apollos is the key concept here. He was Alexandrian, but he was then in Ephesus at this point. And now we scoot forward just a little bit. We're thinking about Corinth. But this is a forum where Apollos may have been teaching. Most likely. It's a good possibility that he was there. It's a possible location of the first century synagogue is right in that same space. Most likely also would have passed by the temple of Apollo in Corinth as well. So if you're looking like where is Apollos doing his business? Right there. There or near there, somewhere in the vicinity. Would have been powerfully refuting the thoughts and ideas of individuals concerning the nature of the Messiah or the Christ. In that area, here we've got this sign on the thing. This is a photo from around 2010 from another guy I know, and he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, proving by the scriptures that Jesus is the Messiah. The citation from Isaiah 53 gives us a connection to the same kind of thing that Paul would do. Remember, Paul's work and Peter's work often started from the Hebrew scriptures say, this is Jesus, this is the Messiah. And so when he's working in that Jewish context, this is one of the passages that they would have been discussing. Now in history, they have it kind of connected there today as well. Paul there, move forward to Acts 19. We encounter there in the text individuals who are, and we use this phrase accommodatively, they're being immersed properly, although we sometimes say rebaptized. It's fine conversationally, but if you're looking at technical terms, you're thinking about what are they doing and why do they do it. There's a large group of people in advance of the coming of the kingdom who were being baptized in the River Jordan, were being baptized out in the wilds, being baptized wherever John was preaching, but none of them were getting a full picture just yet. And so they didn't know about Jesus. They didn't know about anything that was going on. And so Paul encounters men who hadn't heard. They didn't know. The best point to catch from that is to recognize that this too can be us. We too could not know. We could also be confused. We could also be deceived. We could also be self-deceived. Just be very careful with those conversations when they happen, because you can also trick yourself into rewriting your own history. Our feelings are kind of mushy. They don't say concrete about what I did when, way back 20 years, 30 years ago. But it's a good Bible illustration of attaching ourselves to context and thinking about what's going on. Paul then preaches in the synagogue for 3 months. This is a pretty long stay for him to be allowed in the synagogue to a certain degree. Because generally a lot of the stories have it be shorter. 1 week, 2 week, you're out. It's a longer stay there. And then he goes to the school of Tyrannus. He's allowed and afforded the ability to start teaching there. This is one of our illustrations of the community of Christians now establishing spiritual activity in a regular way outside of a connection to a synagogue. Up until this point, we either have Christians meeting in their homes, Christians meeting next to synagogues or in public spaces. This is the first time where Paul is, in essence, we would consider it, if you're going to use 1920s to 1970s language, it's an extended gospel meeting. That's how we would refer to it. This is a tent meeting. If you want to go back into Middle Kentucky, Tennessee band, this is a tent meeting that doesn't end. He remains doing so at Ephesus for 2 to 3 years. And so he is supported and able to do this in a variety of ways, engaging in so much teaching that it says by verse 10, all Asia is hearing about God and hearing the gospel. That's a pretty big claim, right? This whole region is being influenced. Now, think about the way a message spreads. It's not Paul going city to city anymore. He's now got a place to teach, and people are hearing his message and taking it back home with them because they believe that it's important. And so you're starting to see this repeat itself, because that's kind of part of what had happened in Antioch, and now it's repeating here, where he's able to establish a base to teach from, to encourage. You'll see, before we talked about, this is probably 4 or 5 weeks ago, we mentioned, hey, the benefit of the gospel being present at this time. Well, here's another benefit of the regional time frame where people travel from place to place rather than just an information stream. And so people come into the city, they leave the city on a regular basis. So they get to personally talk and come back and be an in-person credible witness when they get back home. Because it's really easy to look at something on the page and say, hey, did you hear this note? It says that someone died and was resurrected in Jerusalem. Oh, that's fake news. No way that happened. Nobody dies and rises again. Okay, here's my cousin who just traveled down to Jerusalem and back, and he was there when he was crucified. He was literally there. Which one's more credible? It's always going to be on the basis of, do you trust your cousin, right? So there's an advantage to the gospel being spread where Paul now is up in Ephesus, engaged in prophetic work as a prophet, able to testify that this is what God said. And you'll note he's performing signs that confirm that the message is true. So when Paul says, this Jesus whom you crucified, he's quoting back and identifying this is what happened. He rose. And then he performs the confirmation of the sign. Like, oh, wait a minute. I'm thinking this is probably real. So it's an advantage to that first-person exchange. It strengthens the possibility of witness for us. And something to think about when we're thinking about how this all plays out. This also is when the implements of magic, the books of magic, are burned. Remember last 2 weeks ago, I showed one of the historic illustrations of Jewish spells. It was inscribed on a clay pot, bottoms of a clay pot. Maybe it was 3 weeks ago, and it's one of their spells to expel a demon. Was one of the Jewish mystics from that time frame. But this takes place Acts 19:19. Good contrast to our earlier interactions with the cult of Diana or Artemis, where they're like, you're taking away all of our livelihood. These are like, here, these are really expensive, let's burn them. I want you to think through that process. I have a good friend who I knew when I was a young convert, and when he was converted himself, he owned a series of convenience stores. This was back at a time frame in the state of California where convenience stores were just starting to really carry alcohol on a regular basis in our community. And he sold them all at a loss as a new convert because he just could not conscientiously continue to engage in the business that they provided. He just couldn't do it. And all the other guys that were his age are telling me how much money he lost doing that, and never batted an eye. I think it's a good illustration for us in both of those instances to always think deeply about the second level consequences of our choices in life. You can accommodate any number of things in your mind that may or may not be wise, but they all have step-out or consequences. And then you see these Christians here. Mercenary feels like, should we sell those books? It's a lot of money for the poor. Who said something like that? Who said something about selling off a really expensive gift that could have been given to the poor? Judas. All right? But those are really expensive. Not everything's worth what we think it is. These folks are recognizing that their souls and their influence seems pretty important. Paul also then at this point sends Timothy to Macedonia. That's around Acts 19, but it's around 57 AD. Sends Titus to Corinth to inquire concerning the effort and effect of that first letter, and to begin the collection for the poor in Jerusalem. So now you can kind of see that 10 years prior to the real conflict coming into the steps of Jerusalem, now there's some financial concerns. Now think about that. Acts chapter 2. What does everyone in Jerusalem do with their money in order to make sure these new Christians from all over the globe are able to stay? What do they do with their land and their property?
Sell it and share it.
Sell it and share it. So that's pushing us to now about 15 years down the road, maybe 20. Now, they ain't got no money. Is that bad stewardship on their part? Are they poor because they're just not good keepers of money? No. That's not all. That's as someone else I know quoted in a comment recently. That doesn't always determine why you're poor. Great stewards, good stewards can be poor for a number of reasons. But you see brethren supporting each other. Because in the past, these brethren in Jerusalem were a great support to all of these other families elsewhere. And so it's the interconnectedness of the people of God being emphasized. Again, here is the Acrocorinth here in Corinth. Again, Acts 19:1 is our text, but this is kind of showing us as well, this is where Paul's influence is going with Timothy, with Titus, with his own interactions with them. In the letters that Paul writes back and forth to the brethren at Corinth, what are some of the accusations made about Paul's preaching? What do they say about it?
Soft.
They say, like, in person, you're weak. You're only strong in letters. And one of the things that is sometimes kind of we think about that is, well, Paul must have not been a very good speaker. And like I mentioned last week, and this week too, for not being a very good speaker, he gets to speak at a lot of places that only the best would be allowed to speak at. So always kind of read that section of the text with a grain of salt. They're upset because Paul's telling them the stuff that they don't want to hear. You're telling us a message that's uncomfortable and making me sweat. And some of it is pretty hard. But wouldn't you want to have something hard said when you need to hear it? And wouldn't you want someone in person to not be mean? On a rational level, that behavior kind of makes kind of sense if you actually care about both sides of the party. Like, you don't need to be yelling at folks to get your message across. And in his letters, he doesn't yell. He's straight. It's like, that's what we got to do. There's lots of other Greek words he could have used that would have been far harsher than the ones that he chose. Again, now we're back at, think about Demetrius of the silversmith here. The mob shouts for 2 hours. Great is Diana of the Ephesians. That's a long time. They're worked up about all the effect of this. Also, this is the case in Acts where this mob is referred to as an ecclesia. That's the same word that we translate church. So realize that nearly exclusively all the words in the Bible, they're just words that convey meaning. They're not special magical words. They're designed to enforce an idea. That's really important when you're discussing big power spiritual concepts. Even what name we put on the church building is designed to convey an idea. And it's potentially 2 or 3 languages away from its origin. And so what's the idea? This is the church that belongs to Christ. Grammatically, you can do a lot of stuff with that. This right here shows us the theater. And so you're thinking, what's going on there? This is the standard theater of the Roman Empire. Like, this is what they look like. You know, this is, if you go to even the ones that were copied in Petra, copies of the theaters there, look, same shape. And the design lets you, if you stand down the middle, you can basically address the crowd. And your voice goes up and you can see all those details. There's a couple other views of this one, but this one matches nearly all the other ones I've been to as well. Small, big, they have the same style, same structure, like rubber stamped. We'll build another one, we'll build another one. And so now you have a spot for the visual of what's going on. And you can imagine the crowd and their response and how it would feel. This is the cultural center for a lot of the dialogue for most of these major cities in the Roman Empire. Paul then goes north to Troas. He's hoping to find Titus bringing him news from Corinth, but they don't arrive at the same time. Back before cell phones were things, and you'd meet people at the airport, did you guys used to have the announcer over the thing call for someone when you go to the Atlanta airport or the big airports? You guys use that back in the day? I know I did because it was fun. It's like, trying to meet your party, you can't find them, don't know where the gate at. I would straight up call. Of course, me being me, I would never use the real people's names. And so a lot of time it was Buddy Payne is there at the airport to get picked up. But this is thinking about the picture of all of this. Them not catching them at the same time. Well, when your journeys take years, it's pretty easy to miss those matching weeks to line up to catch. So this also shifts Paul's plan. He needed to know what's going on. They're also carrying funds. He had no idea. He can't call. He can't text. Hey, there's no tracking. He doesn't have an air tag sticking in Titus's boot to know where he is at all the times. Rich, when you left the house at night when you were a kid, what was your signal to be home by?
Streetlights came on.
Streetlights came on. Standard rule in our house too. I said that one because it's a West Coast rule. All us West Coasters, streetlights, you better be getting home now. It's the official time. Didn't need a watch, didn't need anything. That's not our current world, right? We set hours and times for curfews. And we can track one another. And if your family's involved in using cell phones, you probably know where. I can probably ask half of you, where's your parents right now? And some of you will be like, well, they're right here. Point you on the map. That's kind of giving us a sense of the dependence they had on the letter connections and the relational connections. Paul then will go to Macedonia. Macedonian door opens up. There look at that. He goes across the oceans and finds Titus there with news about the first letter. He will then write 2 Corinthians and eventually travel to Greece. He'll stay there for 3 months, and the Jews are going to once again plot to bring him harm. So you see this stretching out of things as time goes forward. This is going to be Paul's third in-person visit to Corinth. There he writes Romans about 58 AD. He's going to return to Macedonia and Philippi, and then Luke will rejoin him there. Inside the text, you'll probably catch us change in voice in the book of Acts, where Luke goes from, it was said, this happened, to now first person pronouns take place. So his presence there is noted. This is also where Paul demonstrates his long-windedness or timeliness, depending on your perspective of what's going on there. Eutychus falls asleep and falls from the third loft and was killed, and Paul performed a miracle and brought him back to life. Lots of great jokes have been made about this choice. Just never make it about a person in the audience that you're speaking about. It never goes well. It doesn't land the way you want. That's a joke, too, if you're paying attention to the details. Paul then travels to Miletus. He calls for the elders from Ephesus to meet with him, Acts 20. It's about 28 miles south of Ephesus by land. 4 years have passed since Paul established that work at the school of Tyrannus and the synagogue before that. He admonishes these elders to live up to their calling. Gives them a pretty strong message. Remember, this is all part of the larger picture of that work in that time frame. He then heads back to Jerusalem, going first through Tyre. This, we kind of refer to it as the closing of the third missionary journey, if you will. Even though the work there isn't purely evangelistic, it's supportive, it's encouraging, it's strengthening. Some of the key areas, you've got Antioch of Syria, those two Antiochs, just like we've got two Parises on the globe right now. You've got Paris, France, Paris, Tennessee, and the third Paris in Paris, Texas. Well, you got two Antiochs on the map here. It's Antioch of Syria. We got Galatian region, Phrygia, Ephesus, Troas, Macedonia, Corinth, Philippi, and Miletus, closing out with Caesarea or Caesarea at the end. So that's Paul's third cycle of journeys. A lot of stuff goes on there. A lot of letters being written, a lot of textual stuff that we've studied before. But in the end, this helps us see what God is doing. The church is growing. The book of Acts will continue, but there'll be a shift in focus from context. Paul will still be the narrative element that tells us these next stories, but it won't be exclusively about the Gospels preaching per se regionally in this area. We've got about a minute left, and so we can squeeze in. We had to get a lot of the visuals from last week in here today too. So if you guys have any questions or things you want us to look at for the next couple of weeks, or comments? Rich?
You mentioned something about the timing of those trips. I thought I heard 3 years. Was there a different time prior? Like last week you mentioned, was it more like 10 years?
In between those trips,
Yeah.
like an 8-year gap.
Okay.
So the trips themselves tend to be about 3 or 4 years in length, but there's gaps between when they start. So he'll go back. And that's why Antioch of Syria becomes the Gentile convert hub of evangelistic activity, centered often around Paul's work, Barnabas' work, and then Jerusalem is then, in that time frame, a healthy, Jewish strengthened community of Christians. And that also helps us understand their independence and dependence on each other, to where they kind of develop this schism, difference on what you needed to do. Like, do you need to keep the law? And they're sorting some of that stuff out toward the end of it. Our clock is done, and I think next week I'll probably give a little handout to everybody that kind of shows the times and the dates. I've used it before. We'll bring it back up, and you can have a copy of it.